there's no real major political intent. But of course, people do experience, you know, a lot of racism in Dublin, like in any big city. Of course, those things exist in any society, and so the financial crisis in Ireland was very particular in its impact because the Irish economy had been really inflated by the property sector, but property speculation, investment in housing in Ireland and elsewhere, which meant that the banks were overexposed on their property loans, which meant that when the impact of the US fiscal crisis hit the European Union and hit the Irish banks, they were in far more trouble than in most other countries, with the exception obviously of Greece and Spain, Italy, the so-called Greeks. So what that meant was that the austerity in Ireland was much more abrupt and much politically harsher than anywhere else, again with the exception of Greece, Spain, Portugal, because the government basically guaranteed the bank loans to keep as they saw it, to keep the economy afloat, which is still something which is debated. Many people see it as politically a mistake. Which meant that there was very significant cuts in public investment, very significant cuts in, say, public sector pay, which of course had a knock-on effect. Also, the crisis in the banks had a knock-on effect on people's capacity to pay their mortgages, on businesses' capacity to keep going, and also, of course, many enterprises used it as a way also to sort of, you know,
and there's a lot of empty houses now.
I'll get to that in a minute. So it was so in that way, economically, it was a very, very difficult period for people, and it still is very difficult for.
So you still feel the crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, you don't see it when you come to areas like this, which are obviously fueled by consumption, but you do see it if you go to, you know, you don't have to go far outside of Dublin city centre to see areas where people are, you know, manifestly not enjoying a recovery in the economy. But what that meant, particularly for young people, and also it's a very young population in Ireland, like in much of, you know, Southern Europe, if we take it that way, that there was very high youth unemployment, and not as high as Spain or Italy or Greece. But also in Ireland there was a kind of a tradition of a certain kind of emigration, in this, by which I mean by that, not that people necessarily want to emigrate, but emigration or having to emigrate is on their horizons. There's very few people who don't have a family where somebody isn't living in, particularly in London, or Canada, Australia, and obviously the East Coast of the United States. So that's something that people have in their families. Now, having it in their family doesn't mean they celebrate it. It's also something, of course, that often creates a lot of pain and loss and dislocation. But it meant that, let's say, to compare it to what happened in other countries where you have very obvious forms of kind of youth rebellion, what you had in Ireland was much more sense of, well, it's kind of time to look somewhere else again. But some people took this in their stride. You know, in other words, some people would have looked to do this anyway, but also a lot of people didn't. A lot of people were very bitter about it, very, very hurt about it. But again, in a way, the kind of political narrative was that, well, this is a very good opportunity for young people to go abroad and broaden their horizons and come back. But that's not how a lot of people felt. I think they felt, you know, that their chance of building a life for themselves here at home, if they wanted it, was taken away from them. So it was. This was something that loomed large in the kind of public culture in the late 2000s, was the sense of immigration is back, and does that mean that the nation has failed again, if you like, to be able to look after its own society or to socially reproduce? And things. So a very sort of physical connection to this city and feeling,
and to traditions
very at home. Not really, no. I mean, feeling very at home in this city and in some of the traditions around this city in terms of sport and things that people do. But I think I feel much more connected to Dublin, and as a Dubliner, than I do to Ireland and Irishness in some ways. Which is not to say that there aren't things that make me feel Irish, but I don't in the same way as I have a kind of connection to here. I don't feel it personally as strongly, unless of course I'm abroad and something terrible happens or that kind of thing. Then of course you feel it. In terms of more broadly thinking about national identity as an academic, I mean, people have very personal, intimate, subjective ways, like me, in which they feel part of something.
Sure.
Then the question is, how are you invited to experience yourself as part of a collective, as a national collective, which is always through something which is, for the most part, some kind of event, some kind of ritual, something spectacular. So like sports, national, I think identify a lot with sport as a kind of a mode of national identity. In many ways, I think because also, the politics of nation, the politics of nationalism in Ireland are so complicated and so full of conflict that I think sport is, and that's the way that it operates in every nation. I think, as I said, there isn't at the moment a very strong political invitation to experience nationality as something meaning that others can't have it. But of course that's also there in the way in which Irish identity and Irish nationality, like any nationality, works. Like Hong Kong barbecue behind there, there's a big stadium there called Croke Park, which is a stadium for Gaelic football and hurling, which are sports which are only played in Ireland. So Australian football is quite close in some ways. That's played in Australia and developed from it through immigration. And that's a special place to go because, especially when Dublin played there, because this is kind of certain ritual around match day and around the pubs around about, and people tend to walk there from different parts of the city. It's very central.
I wanted to ask, do you witness how did Dublin become the hub of all these IT companies?
Yeah, I mean that's
a specific reason. Or?
There's very specific reasons, which is the tax policy. I mean the tax, and this is an ongoing and constant controversy because again, you have a situation over the last years where there's a very serious housing crisis in Dublin. So there's simply both in terms of the way in which the housing market is unregulated, and in terms of affordable housing everywhere. Because of course, as I said, people's wages have gone bluntly down. Price of housing is going back up. Price of rents are going back up. Dublin is becoming for a city with 5-6 universities. So when you have a situation on that question where there's a significant problem with sort of public health. People have very long waiting times for operations and to be looked after. Questions of housing, these things. There's a real problem with social provision, as in most countries where austerity has meant cutting state expenditure on social provision. And at the same time, you have huge companies based in Ireland that are paying tiny amounts of tax, and where even without necessarily being revolutionary about it, but paying a couple of percentage more in tax, which would have minimal impact on their profits, but would have a significant impact in terms of contributing to the exchequer and to the state here. That's just not on the political agenda, and the reason for that is because the prosperity of those years, and now the idea that this prosperity is returning, has been based on this idea that Ireland is a small country, it's very close to the UK, and obviously Brexit has made this very complicated now, but it's very close to the US, it's English speaking, it's a kind of Western gateway to Europe, and it has a young, educated workforce, and therefore kind of low tax regime plus government incentives to come and to invest in Ireland, and therefore to create employment. That's been what the policy is very much about. So you have Apple's European headquarters, you have Facebook's European headquarters, you have Google, which is massive. The tax regime is a big problem. I mean, I think that it's significantly out of line with how other countries impose taxation requirements on multinational companies. So it's also, in a sense, undercutting the social model in other countries. And it means that here, there is no social model because...
Do you think more companies will settle in Ireland in the future, like in Dublin?
Quite possibly. I mean, of course, once you have a certain critical mass, it also attracts other companies because of the relations between them. Whether the Dublin infrastructure at a certain point will start to create a problem for companies is another question, right? In terms of sort of, affordability and all of these things. Multinational companies take that quite seriously too. But it is also true that one of the things that happened in the boom and in the aftermath in particular is that Ireland was also always, in terms of how power operates, in terms of how the media thinks about the country, Dublin was always disproportionately powerful. even far more so than London, let's say, in the kind of UK scenario. It's even more so now because a lot of parts of the country have been simply stripped of resources, stripped of their major employment possibilities and investments and that kind of thing. So I think Dublin is disproportionately. The difference is simply that the population of Cork. Cork County is about 110,000 people, so Cork City, somewhat less than that, I think. Yeah, and the population of Dublin, Greater Dublin area is, something like 1.7 million. IT investments we're talking about now in Dublin city centre, right? So in other words, the kind of social media and sort of digital economy companies. It's much later. A lot of the sort of IT companies that came under that earlier foreign direct investment regime were not actually based in Dublin city centre that much. I mean, they're based more, in kind of Greater Dublin area, but also around Cork, Limerick, Galway, the Midlands. So I lived out of Dublin for about 7 years, and when I came back, I really noticed that at the height of all of that sort of, find somewhere decent to live, and that it would be connected by public transport and these kinds of things was not easy. Really. Yeah, it's extremely expensive, and also because it's just, as I said, it's not just in Dublin. It's much easier for landlords to increase the rent. The rents always go up; they never come down by law, making Dublin a very difficult city for a lot of young people in particular to live in. They get the worst of both worlds. They get the rising prices, they get the rising rent, and a much more insecure and precarious employment and that kind of thing.